like to introduce our very special guest today, the extraordinary Eileen Murray. Eileen Murray is the chair of the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, better known as FINRA, where she has served on the Board of Governors since 2016. Eileen is the former co-chief executive officer of Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund with $138 billion of assets under management, and having taken the chief executive reins from Bridgewater's founder, Ray Dalio. Now, prior to joining Bridgewater, Eileen held several senior executive roles at Morgan Stanley as the global head of technology and operations, where she oversaw more than 10,000 employees and an annual budget of $5.5 billion. And she subsequently served in a similar role for Credit Suisse, where she oversaw more than 7,000 employees and an annual budget of $4 billion, and was the first woman to serve on the bank's executive board. In addition to Eileen's extraordinary career, she serves on various corporate and charitable boards, corporate boards including HSBC, the Guardian Life Insurance Company, Compass, charitably the Irish Arts Center, among many others. And Eileen has received more awards than for her leadership and her philanthropic efforts than we have time to enumerate, but just a couple include the Lifetime Achievement Award from Markets Media, Hedge Fund Journal's 50 Leading Women in the Hedge Fund Industry, U.S. Bankers' Most Powerful Women in Banking, Irish Magazine's 100 Best and Brightest Leaders, and the list goes on and on. But to hear more from Eileen than about Eileen, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our distinguished guest and industry legend, Mrs. Eileen Murray. Eileen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mo, and let me also join you in thanking the sponsors for this incredibly important cause, and thank you for doing this.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so let's dive right in. You had an interesting path to Wall Street. Maybe we could just start off by you sharing a little bit about your journey and how you ended up at Morgan Stanley.
Yeah, I went to Morgan Stanley pretty early in my career. How I got there, I grew up in a housing project in the top of Manhattan, and I was fortunate that I basically grew up with people from all walks of life, people from of all different colors, gender, and so on and so forth. And I went to a college, Manhattan College, which is a college for children of immigrants, which has changed its face over time. And when I went there, I was encouraged to go into accounting by people, whereas a number of other people were saying, geez, accounting's not really for women. So I actually went to, at the time, Pete Morick, one of your big sponsors, KPMG now, and I was in the accounting group there. And when I left after 4 years, I was the most experienced person. This is almost laughable in the securities industry at the non-partner level. And so I went over to Morgan Stanley, and it was before they were public. And quite candidly, the reason I went there was I could go and work for triple the money for probably half the hours, which is not a good reason why I initially went there. But ultimately, having gone there, it was a fantastic experience. So that, pretty much was my first 26 years of my life.
And so let me actually go back to the first part of those 26 years, because it sounds like you grew up in a fairly humble environment. How was what was unique about your upbringing, or perhaps your personal history, other than that it was a humble environment, that sort of contributed to you becoming the person you are today?
I think there's something to be said that's pretty truthful about you learn everything you know in the first 5 or 10 years. I forget how many years they give you, but I was very fortunate to have two really great people for parents whom I loved, but I actually would like as people. Mm-hmm. And they gave us two really terrific gifts. One was love of family, and two was raising us in an environment, and they themselves being colorblind, religious blind. I have, 5 brothers and 3 sisters, and trust me, there was no difference between who did the chores. And then, when you grew up in a housing project, people will tell me, I remember I was at a Robin Hood get together. And someone said to me, I saw the Dyton Street housing projects up, but we're collecting money for them. They said, can you imagine growing up in that place? I was like, well, actually, yeah, I grew up there. It was pretty good. And so, you couldn't buy a vacation for where I grew up, meaning you had people from different, I lived on the 9th floor of a 14-floor apartment building, which was great, by the way, at Halloween. But anyways, that aside, there were people from 4 different countries, Cuba, probably even more, Italy. We had, down the hall, the Laskys were, people who were in a concentration camp. We had people from Puerto Rico, Estonia. So you had all these people, and you just didn't think about color or anything, and everybody kind of helped each other out. So what it gave me was an open-mindedness and a blindness towards anything other than diversity of thought.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have that kind of blindness, it's a great gift, because you're just listening to people for what they have to contribute. And I think I didn't get to where I am in life because of me. I got to where I am in life by getting other people who had different ways of thinking, together, and listening to them and really promoting them. And so that was a great gift my parents gave to us as kids, and the neighborhood I grew up in. So, I could go to Greece, I could go to Africa, but where could I go and have all of that in one place,
right,
with different foods, different languages, different religions? I mean, it was beautiful. Now, there are other people who would see it very differently to me. But yeah, I loved it. And I think that teaches you to work hard. It's about hard work, not about who you are, and treat other people respectfully and how you'd want to be treated. And I know that sounds trite, but that's what I learned from my parents. And as I'm 63 years old now, actually, and those lessons were lessons that I don't really need to know much more, because everything else in life, anything that's technical, there's always someone that knows more, so you just have to talk to them.
Right. Right. So, all right. So that is, first of all, phenomenal experience and learnings from the first 26 years, and particularly the earlier ones. Think about the next 26 years. I mean, all of the successes you've had, Bridgewater, Morgan Stanley, Credit Suisse, and so on. If you think about the aggregate of your professional experience, what do you think was some of the most instructive experiences that you had? And what might you wish you knew about the investment and financial service industry before you reached the top of it?
Yeah. Well, some of the aha moments for me in my career, Mo, were I remember when I became controller at Morgan Stanley, and I really didn't think I should have the job. I grew up in the fixed income piece of Morgan Stanley, and so I was like, gosh, I don't really know equities as well, et cetera. I didn't understand that the reason I was picked for the job was because how I was managing people, not necessarily what I knew technically. So I learned that. But anyways, the first 6 months, I'm, working, 100 and something hours a week, trying to get everything done. And after 6 months, my family said, listen, you have a choice. It's us or Morgan Stanley. And I thought, wow, I don't want to pick either one of those choices. So I better figure out a way to get my hours at Morgan Stanley down. And I just realized I don't need to know everything. And I just started asking other people for help that I thought could help me on my journey. And it was like this huge box of rocks was lifted off my back. And it always astounds me how there are people in a room, even at my age today, that feel the need to be the smartest person in the room. And you never are. There's always someone that knows something more about something. So that was a great that was a great learning experience for me. And then the second big aha moment for me was I worked on the swap desk, and I'd say at the time probably 30% of my staff was women, maybe 40%. And 3 of them went on maternity at the same time, so I let them all work from home. And I get a phone call from HR, I don't know how much later, and they say, listen, Eileen, people working from home is against our firm's policy. And I was like, wow, I didn't even know we had a policy on that, but we better change it because the work's not getting done otherwise. And so then I was asked to talk to certain people on the management committee, and I was asked to go away and put together the business case for diversity. And honestly, Mo, I thought it was a joke. So I was like, okay, well, why don't you tell me the business case for homogeneity, expecting, roarish laughter. And I look around the room and the joke was on me. Nobody was laughing. They were dead serious. It was surprising to me that that diversity would require a business case. It like never dawned on me. And so it was a learning experience for me as I became more senior, that there were people who made distinctions, a lot of it unconscious, but some of it conscious, on the basis of what people look like, what religion they might be, what color they might be, what gender they might be. And the rationale for it was, to me, illogical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so understanding that, that there was that big distinction was another big haha moment for me. And then I learned that I could really continue to use that as an opportunity to get more and more creative ideas in terms of what I was doing. In terms of what do I wish I knew as I went through my career, I think that there were times in my career when I put work first and I probably shouldn't have, and I sweated over things and worried about things that I can't even remember now. And so I think that, having the common sense to having someone to say, hey, listen, this is not the end of the world, whatever, they say to the man or woman with a toothache, the world's a tooth. Having the perspective to put in perspective, the things that I used to worry about and the things I used to emphasize, having a little bit more wisdom earlier on, or getting that from someone else, probably would have been helpful. But other than that, honestly, to God, I feel so fortunate. I feel like God has been so good to me. And did I make mistakes in my career? If you have another couple of days, I could go through them with you. But I feel pretty lucky where I am, and I feel very blessed.
Yeah, no, first of all, yeah, I mean, we don't have a couple of days, but I'd love to know, if you think about those mistakes, the most instructive ones or the most enlightening ones. I mean, obviously, there's no shortage of extraordinary achievements that make up who you are, but they didn't get there. You didn't get to all those achievements without breaking an egg or two along the way. What were the most enlightening and valuable mistakes that you could?
I think one of the biggest mistakes I made early on was thinking that just because someone was senior to me, they knew more than me, or knew things better, or knew how we should approach things.
Right.
And it would have saved me a lot of time to have had more confidence or insight to understand that, people, feel vulnerable to say they don't know what they're talking about. And I can think of several situations in that. Probably the most, the one that probably not. I don't think that was really a mistake. Mistake's a big word. But I think the biggest mistakes I've made is really relying on people because of their title or because of where they might have been in a particular position. And that cost reg capital charges to certain firms. So we worked through it again. That caused a delay in getting certain employee policies put through. Work from home is a good example. You want to do work from home, and someone more senior says, well, it's a bad idea. Let me tell you why. And you kind of think, well, they must know what they're talking about. They really don't. So, well, I shouldn't say it that way, but you know what I mean? It's like understanding that there are people in life that don't feel comfortable saying they don't know the answer to a particular question, and knowing who to ask, and not being a wise guy about it. I remember one mistake I think I made was many, but one that sticks out in my mind, and I don't know why. I was on it. Years and years ago, they used to have security counts. So there'd be these big fat packs of, IBM securities. You had to count them and, tick off on this computer paper. There were X number of them. And the guy who was running the security count, I was the only woman. I had this beautiful white suit that I bought on at the time, and went down into the basement of 120 Broadway. It was dusty. It was ridiculous. This guy's like, I can't believe we have a woman there. He made a lot of women jokes. And I looked at him, and I knew that he was not going to like what I said. And I said, I really think you'd look much better in this skirt than I do. I bet you'd even like to wear it. And, everyone laughed at him. And it sounds like a silly thing. And I felt so terrible that I made him feel so bad. I became him. Yeah. And so, to me, I want to be who I am. I don't need to be somebody else. If someone else is that way, like God bless and let them be. I don't need to. So for some reason, that kind of stuff sticks in my head
Right.
as a big mistake. But am I going to tell you that I blew something up or something? No. I'm not a scientist. I didn't kill anybody. I'm not a doctor or nurse. But I've made mistakes on, like I said, listening to people that I probably shouldn't have listened to, and I should have researched more. Is what the information they're giving me really reliable? And like I said, that manifested itself in so many different ways in terms of time delays to get to better outcomes. I don't know
Yeah.
if that's.
Perfect.
I'm sorry, I don't have a great story for you.
This is
Uh,
great. It's great. I'm gonna come back to the diversity topic in a few minutes.
sure, take
But
your
just
time.
before we get there, I want to, over the course of your career, you've had this front row seat to many of the evolutions in the financial services world. Um, what do you think have been some of the biggest changes from your point of view? And then I'm gonna follow that up with some of the
Sure.
last.
I think that globalization has been a huge change from 1980 to today. Um, you know, um, Two, I'm gonna put this. Most of what I'm saying, I think, has all been enabled by technology. I think globalization has been enabled by technology. Transparency has been huge on information and the speed of it. Customer and employee expectations have changed dramatically. And we could go through the details of that in terms of fee structures, what clients expect, et cetera, et cetera. And then, I think the other big change has been what I'll call a lack of connectedness or contactlessness. And what I mean by that, you used to go into a bank to, take money out. You used to pay your bills in a certain way. And now everything is done without really being in contact with other people. You can really do a lot with that. So I think the big changes have been enabled by technology. They've been around employee and customer expectations. They've been around the level of contact that people have with each other. And there's been a huge change in transparency, which I think has fueled, a lot of the focus and margin compression that we've seen, and a lot of speed up of the transaction cycle. And then even things like, algorithmic trading and so on and so forth, that has evolved dramatically over time. But when you step back and look at all of that, a lot of what used to be, pretty good margin business has pretty much become commoditized.
Mhm.
And so I think the question for the future is, particularly with costs going down and so on and so forth, how do you remain relevant, and what is your competitive advantage? I think is more challenging today than it was, say, 30 years ago.
Well, I mean, that's a great point. And just as a clarifying, I mean, you sit on the board of HSBC, and you've kind of led banks. I mean, we've seen effectively a majorly deflationary environment. How are the big financial institutions thinking about maintaining those profit margins on a go forward basis at anything near the scale that they've had until now?
Well, the profit margins have come down over the last 30 years, right? In so many different places. I think continuing to be focused on the client. I think digitization in terms of not just digital assets in terms of crypto, et cetera, but really digitizing the legacy assets is in terms of driving down costs. I also think in terms of evaluating risk more multidimensionally. And then lastly, I think the winners are going to be the places that really provide great career paths for people. I don't think that's really changed much in terms of that will still be a factor. But I think, banks are reinventing themselves. I mean, if you look at the work how Goldman's reinvented itself more recently in terms of digitization, and how they focus on their clients. But at the end of the day, you're still going to need somebody to lend money, right? So I
Mhm.
think lending is still there in a pretty big way. In terms of retail credit cards and all that kind of stuff, the consumer side of it, I think that will continue to become digitized. And I think that I think that technology will create more jobs, but I think that we'll have to really retool and reskill people to take up what those new jobs are versus what's there today. And I think the financial institutions are going to have to really be part of that change to stay relevant and to stay competitive.
Hmm. And again, I'm
But what do you think?
you know, nobody's on here to hear what I have to say. So but I do, just to answer your question, I do think that every financial institution has to figure out where value is going to be created in a world that's has been progressively deflationary, and anybody that thinks that they're entitled to charge or to receive the kind of compensation that they've received is could be that turkey that's sort of we'll see that day in Thanksgiving, and it unexpectedly comes through. So I think that there's there are certain challenges having the industry turn as quickly as I think it will need to. I mean, we've seen with COVID, how much innovation has been pulled forward, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that also. All of the changes that COVID brought forward, what are some of the lasting impacts that you see?
I think the biggest lasting impact, which is probably obvious, is there were a lot of, certainly not consulting firms or accounting firms, but a lot of firms really resisted this, allowing people to work from home and the mobility of the workforce. And I think companies companies were forced to do that, some rather quickly. And I don't think we're going back to the day where, everybody sat in the office together. I used to be a big speaker and promoter, Mo, of people working from home, 60, 70% of the time. I'm not a promoter of 100% of the time. And the reason I'm not is I think that you still need to have training and development, some of which, takes place not just on Zoom, but in person. And I think community and social ways that we are at work with each other are an important part of an entity's fabric. So I think that, the days of people arguing about whether you work from home or not, those days are over. I think we have a very mobile workforce, and we will continue to have a mobile workforce. I think how we train and develop people will look at a lot of our kids haven't been able to go back to school, and we've been on the Zoom calls or whatever the schools use to get the kids in. So I think the whole way we educate and teach people will have changes. And I think that, as you know, AI, I mean, this isn't about COVID. I think it's all been moved forward. I agree with you. But the changes have already been enacted. I mean, we're going down the path of AI. We're going down the path of robotics. We're going down the path of digital assets. We're going down the path of things being enabled by, blockchain technology. And so I think COVID has accelerated some of that. Like we look at where was Zoom, 2 years ago? Nowhere, right? But I think we'll still evaluate and I think things are still in process as to how do industries reinvent themselves? How does the conferencing industry, people that make money doing conferencing, that's going to change dramatically. So there's so many industries that are changing, and I think they were already, and COVID just accelerated it, as you said.
Well, so amidst those changes, and amidst all those things that you mentioned, what excites you most about the future? In other words, when you look over the horizon, here's the things that I'm most excited about. Here's the things that I'm most scared of. What come to mind?
Sure. What I'm most excited about is basically the possibilities that technology provides to reduce inequality and to expand education, in a very pervasive way. Well, I'm equally most frightened by that. And what I mean by that is I think I was reading something, 27% there'll be 27% new jobs in 2022 that people aren't prepared for. So how do we go from a education system that's a 4-year college and so on and so forth, or companies educating people? How do we retool and reskill people for the new economy, for the fourth industrial revolution? I think we have 20th century ways of developing and training people and educating them, and we need to really change that in the 21st century. Why does it frighten me? Because if we don't do that, I think we're going to continue to have a gap in equality, particularly economically, which will be driven by, in part, education. And I think we'll have a lot of unemployment, which, if you've been unemployed for a long time, it creates a hopelessness that becomes part of your psyche for your entire life. So I'm most frightened about those. I'm most frightened by it, but I also think that there's also a tremendous opportunity here to avoid all of that and to really expand how we look at education. And I think it has to be a partnership between both private and public, government and business, to figure out how to do this. And I think it's going to be a whole networking and ecosystem of how we approach that.
Well, so if this displacement that you're describing, which is the rate of change technologically, is occurring faster than the current retooling of the workforce, right? And that will lead to potentially mass unemployment, obviously due to automation. Now, over time, that gap will hopefully be filled. But in the meantime, what does that mean for markets? What does that mean for the economy broadly? What does that mean for business owners and capital allocators? Like, what are the ramifications of that?
Well, I think it creates opportunities in terms of there'll be disruptors in the education space that'll be part of businesses. So I think there's opportunities for that. If there's big unemployment and continued taxation on corporations, I think that is something that's a big, a big weight for the economy to carry. I mean, if you just step back for a second, I don't believe we should wait for us to, these numbers are staggering. McKinsey, I think, said something like 375 million people by 2030 will be out of the workforce, 54 million of them in my country, in the United States. 54 million people of the working class people is a lot of people. You're starting to approach rates that are similar to the Depression. Now, I'm not saying that there won't be new jobs. I'm just saying what you just said, the rate at which you will need to be educated to fill those jobs is pretty staggering. So I think people know what it means for the economy when there's high levels of unemployment, and what it means for the markets. And so I think that, I'm not here to give a lesson on that, but I think that's pretty self-evident. So just like with the pandemic, we didn't know the pandemic was coming. You got a bunch of people from many different disciplines, very smart people, to look at this problem and figure out how do we solve this problem. Now, there are some things people did that weren't great, and some things that were. And I think this education issue with the retooling and reskilling is the next pandemic, the unskilled worker.
Interesting. And and listen, I think this all comes to a head as I'm hearing you talk in terms of talent and talent development. And and maybe I could actually tie two topics together, because you were talking about diversity and inclusion, and I'd like to really come back and hear what you've seen over your career. You've always been a really vocal proponent of diversity and inclusion throughout your career, partly perhaps because of your background. But one of the questions that I had was, let's say everybody was actually 100% committed to diversity and inclusion. We're seeing a diminishing talent pool because people are not being retooled. So is the talent pool even there? And if everybody was committed to it, what are the things that we could do to move?
Interesting. The way I want to just rephrase the way you asked your question. The question, the way you're phrasing it, sounds to me like if we don't retool and re-educate, then we won't be able to have diversity and inclusion. I'm not saying you're saying that, but and I just want to hit that for a second and then come back to retooling. When we graduate, let's just use gender as an example. We graduate, I think it's around the globe and in most of our countries, 52% of the graduates are women. So they're qualified. Right. Now, people will say, well, they're not in the areas that are growing. Some of that's true, like the STEM areas, the science, engineering, mathematics, etc. So we need more to do there to get those qualifications. But I don't buy the notion that This is just a skill set issue for people who are diverse, because we all start out of college and out of the MBA programs kind of on a similar footing. So it's really what happens beyond that. Companies have focused dramatically on diversity. And I think the big problem, and I've been talking about this for 20 years, is they don't focus on inclusion. So we focus on, hey, I got 10% of those and 20% of these, and now I have them in my company, and God bless, and go figure it out. You have to work on how do you include people. Right. The retooling piece, I think, is more broad-based than diversity and inclusion. I think it's beyond that. When you look at the numbers, I think it's, our entire swaths of the population. And so that, I think, is a bigger issue, and is kind of over. I would put diversity and inclusion as a pillar of that, but I think it's a bigger issue than diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I conflated two things that shouldn't have been conflated, and really the question was, how do we develop talent in two different areas? Number one is where it needs to be retooled, and number two, how do we make sure that that talent is developed with a focus on diversity and inclusion? But they shouldn't. The two shouldn't have been connected quite the way I had intended.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to. I don't mean to be overly sensitive. I just think I think our big issue is how we have jobs that are going to be there in the future. Are we spending enough time imagining what they are, and are we spending enough time thinking about how do we train and develop people for those opportunities? Right. And how do we do it in a way that's sensible? So, companies save tons of money laying people off because through automation, and then they have to rehire other people. Why don't we have something like, I don't know, a tax credit for companies that, retool and reskill people, or a regulatory capital benefit? And why don't we, hit companies for half of their savings? I'm making all this up. I don't have the solution. I wish I did. But what I do think is, if we all recognize we have a problem and start thinking about how we solve it versus, honestly, Mo, I've talked to people who are like, we don't have a problem with unemployment. We're going to have plenty of jobs. Yeah, we're going to have plenty of jobs. I agree. But are we going to have the people retooled and reskilled to take those jobs? Right. And if we're not, and you believe, if you only believed half of the numbers that McKinsey, BCG, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, if you only believed half of the numbers that are out there, you'd have to agree we got a big problem that's coming ahead of us. And why wait till it happens?
And just, I fully agree. In terms of the impact that you've seen on companies who've adopted, meaningful diversity and inclusion measures, and those that haven't, is there a way that either allocators of capital or entrepreneurs can measure the tangible benefit, could actually point to it and say?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that allocators of capital have a tremendous power in terms of, helping companies think through what makes them most profitable. There's been study after study, I can send them to you, that diversity results in higher levels of profitability, EBITDA, etc. Now, what hasn't been done is, why is that? What is it about diversity? Or what is it about anybody that causes that? And there hasn't been a lot of studies on that. Is it people who are more flexible? Is it people who are more risk-taking? What is it? Mm-hmm. But without a doubt, the studies over the last 20 years would point to, by people a lot smarter than me at a lot of these consulting firms, that without a doubt, diversity improves profitability. And so if that's true, and I'm happy to get the studies, like I said, if that's true, then you would think that people would want there to be more focus on that to get more profitable returns. The reality is that the transparency in that, right? I just said people had to do all these studies. If you wanted to look at the overall risk of a particular company, their market or credit risk, you could pull out their report and see what that is. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to see how a company manages and develops its people, there aren't standards and transparency around talent development. There aren't standards around diversity and inclusion. There aren't standards around a lot of things in ESG that are, clearly going to help companies be more profitable over the long haul. the way there are disclosures in the financial statement. So I think getting greater levels of disclosure, which I think would be the first step, because if it's measured, it'll be managed, would be a great first step. And I think that the owners of capital that allocate capital have a huge say in the marketplace as to what is valued.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier, and you were talking about the introduction of various technologies. You yourself have been an investor and an advisor to various startup ventures in the realm of, artificial intelligence and machine learning and so on and so forth. Could you maybe give us some examples how you see AI and machine learning impacting both investors and consumers of financial services? Perhaps it's some of the companies you're involved with or anything else. Like, what do you see as some of the big shifts?
I think a lot of the transaction type work that's done today lends itself dramatically to automation, which hasn't fully been done yet. And point two, on the AI side, I mean, basically you have people using their judgment to look at patterns that if you alternatively, particularly in the risk space, had machines looking at those patterns, you would have more reliable pattern recognition. You'd probably have the flags done sooner, and you'd displace people out of those jobs. I would go even far as to say, a lot of the work that's done in credit and so on and so forth, much the way you've seen equities, really become dramatically automated. Now, how do you apply artificial intelligence to that people are doing today? I think is a tremendous opportunity and is already starting to take place in many places.
And are you seeing that again? Because you were in the heart and soul of the banks. Like, are you seeing that actually being?
I think what you're seeing right now is you're seeing a continuation of the migration to the cloud, where a lot of people have their focus on. And as they are migrating to the cloud and getting more comfortable with that, they're starting to turn their attention to more and more opportunities in analytics and so on and so forth to a greater degree than they have before.
Right.
But I think we're at honestly, I think we're at the more the beginning than the end of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you touched earlier on, digital assets. And again, I think one of the companies you work with is a company called Luca, I believe. And, whether you put on your HSBC cap or your FINRA cap, how do you see digital assets permeating the financial service industry?
Again, I think we're at the beginning, but I think digital assets are here to stay. I think they're a way to exchange value. It had the technology itself has issues with it. But just like, it's like when we started with the internet, people were only comfortable doing an intranet because they somehow felt safer. I think, digital currencies 4 years ago, people, were kind of frightened by them. I think people are becoming more and more comfortable with digital assets. They're becoming more and more comfortable with the efficiencies that are provided by them. But they also are concerned about how do you use it in scale and size? What are some of the security issues with it? And I think as the technology evolves, those issues will find resolution. Mm-hmm. But I think digital assets are here to stay, and the efficiency of them, I don't think is really arguable.
And you said a word in terms of value. There's clear value to them. One of the, I don't remember, but one of the previous speakers that we had, we were talking a little bit about non-fungible tokens and NFTs and some of the others. How value is established in digital assets? Like, there's one thing is take an existing asset and digitize it, and the other is a purely digital asset, which is kind of hard to wrap your hands around. How do you view that evolution?
I think on the first one you said, I think that it's clear that you could exchange, be it artwork or whatever it is you want to exchange, digitally, right? And we're migrating from a physical world to a digital world in that respect. Where those two overlap, in other words, if I bought a digital painting, would I be happy with just the digital record of that and not the physical painting? Probably not. I wouldn't be.
Right.
Maybe the world will evolve to that. In terms of the actual value of a currency or so on and so forth, with from a digital perspective, that's still evolving, and there's lots of questions around that, as you well know. So I'm not going to sit here and purport to have the answer on that, but there's certainly a lot of value ascribed to it, right? And
Right.
so, you know, I see more value in the digitization right now, and I see more value in the ability to exchange assets more rapidly. And then I see that crypto is nothing more as an exchange, like a dollar or some other currency to be able to do that.
Right.
And the
So,
value typically goes through supply and demand, but that's being turned on its side there.
sure, sure. So, I mean, even in the short conversation, we've touched on a lot of things that you're involved with, a lot of organizations, a lot of projects. You said a bunch of boards, advising startups, serving as chair of a major regulatory authority. How do you pick and choose the things that you get involved with? And maybe you could also talk a little bit about the traits of the people that you look to work with and those that you wouldn't.
Well, first of all, I like to continuously learn and stay relevant. So I think technology is here to stay. I think if I don't continue to learn about technology and its applications and what it enables, I could see myself becoming less relevant. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a programmer, but what the capabilities of these technologies are mind blowing. And so I really enjoy learning about that. And I think I think I guess the new term that's coined is the fourth revolution, right? Fourth revolution. And so I really enjoy learning in that. And then how can I apply it? But before that, I've spent a lot of my career working with some really great people, and I've worked with some people I would prefer not to work with. And so now I'm at a point in my life where I get to choose who I work with. And that's really important to me. I think as you get older, you realize time is really a very precious commodity. And so who you spend time with, I think for me, has become an incredibly important part of my life. And I want to spend time with people who are curious, who have integrity, and if possible, low ego, but not a requirement, and who are open-minded. That to me is like so joyous. It's like joyful to spend my time with people like that. And what I also want to do is make sure that, like I said earlier in this conversation, God's been very good to me. And so I want to make sure that, I'm having impact to the best of my ability in terms of what I'm doing. I'm still trying to figure out, I'm probably more of a generalist than I am someone on a particular. And so if you looked at what I'm doing right now, you'd probably say, oh my God, like it just sounds like a hodgepodge of like, what are you doing? And actually, they all connect between two vectors. One is technology and one is financial services. So they all connect through that. But the bigger connection for me is working with great people who want to make changes for the better and who are just people who are good people that I like to spend time with. And like I said, hopefully having impact. So there's lots of places we could all have impact, but who you have impact with may not matter to you. It matters to me now. And those are the qualities of the people that I look for.
Right. And anything still sits on your bucket list in terms of what you still hope to achieve?
I have to tell you the truth. I never set out with I want to achieve X, Y, and Z. I never did. I never said, in 3 years I'll be here or in 4 years I'll be there. So I'm kind of more where things take me.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as I'm having impact and I'm enjoying who I'm spending time with, that would be good enough for me.
Right. And again, it seems like, you've placed this great emphasis on quality people, on people that are curious and thoughtful and have something to teach you. So when you think about some of your own role models and personal inspirations, be curious as to who those people are and what might have been the best pieces of advice or wisdom that anyone has imparted on you that stands out.
Well, I'm going to say something that I really sincerely mean, and it took me time to understand this. The person I've learned the most from in my life, even through my business career, is my mother.
Hmm.
I remember, after 9/11, which was a disastrous time for everybody, and I was down in the city for 3 days straight, helping understand what was going on with the financial systems. And I was at Morgan Stanley, and we had tons of people down at the World Trade Center, which was awful. And there was a certain way people reacted during that process that I didn't feel was consistent with my values.
Hmm.
And on the other side of the coin, to be honest with you, Mo, I was like, geez, I've been at Morgan Stanley for almost 20 years. Like, I don't even know if I'm good enough to work anywhere else.
Hmm.
But I was going through this and torturing myself for months. And I talked to my mother, and she said, what, I don't know what you do for a living. I really don't. But what I do know is one thing. If you're not true to who you are and you're not true to your values, you're going to be a miserable person. So whatever it is you're frightened of, forget it, because that's the most frightening thing for you. And I was like, Jesus, she's right. It was time for me to leave. And, but there were very simple things, or my mother was incredibly generous and had very little, but I won't go into those stories. So throughout my life, she really impacted me tremendously. And believe me, she didn't have it easy. From a professional perspective, I'd say the person who was the most helpful to me was a guy by the name of John Mack. John Mack is around and well. And John Mack was someone who was incredibly tough, but fair. And he really didn't care if you were a woman. He didn't care if, whatever you were, as long as you got the job done and you did it well. And he was a terrific sponsor of mine for many, many years, and ultimately a mentor. And so he was someone who, grew up in North Carolina, son of a shopkeeper. His parents were from Lebanon. They were Catholics down in North Carolina. And so he knew what it was like, I think, to be on the outside. And he made sure he created environments for everyone to be on the inside, so long as they did a good job. And he was very courageous and is very courageous. And so he didn't have to do that. He could have picked people it would have been easier for him to pick. But he really valued people. He valued teamwork. And he went out of his way to be a champion for diversity and inclusion before anyone even used those words.
Right.
And so I feel very fortunate to have worked for him. He's still a good friend. And I would say those two people. And his honesty and integrity, I would say, second to none.
And two quick questions.
Sorry, I probably told you more than you wanted to hear.
No, it's great. Perfect. I two quick questions just before we wrap up. I asked you about some of your role models, inspirations, best piece of advice. Were there any books or writings that you credit with materially having shifted or transformed your world?
There's a book by Cahill Gibran called The Prophet, which I'm sure you've read, and I'm sure many people have read. When I was in 8th grade, my father, those little books you get in 8th grade when you graduate and people write those silly things in it? Yeah. My father wrote me something from Cahill Gibran, which at the time I was like, I don't know why the hell he wrote this. Never say I found the truth, but rather a truth. I won't go through the rest of it. And, I've read The Prophet probably 8, 9, 10 times, and I always get something out of it. Always. And it's about, life and people. And so, yes, I've read many technical books, but for me, The Prophet has really inspired me to really reflect on things in a way that without that, I wonder if I would have.
And just one last question, and to wrap us up. I mean, we spoke a lot about your successes in your career, but you've also done a lot of really interesting things on the philanthropic side of things. How do you decide what it is that you're going to invest your time and money into from a philanthropic point of view? How have you kind of evolved some of your giving and donating, again, all of your time, resources, and energy and creativity too?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm on the Irish Arts Center, which I love, and honestly, initially went on it because my mother asked me to, but I loved it, and I'm involved in how do you retain the culture and the history, and how do you give money to that, because a lot of it's not retained. And then I've been involved in the YMCA. I've been involved as a board member. I've been involved in a number of boards. And what I found for me, Mo, is I prefer to be more involved than a board member. So, for example, I was on the board of Manhattan College, and I would always go and hang out with the student body, the student governing body, because I wanted to know what's going on in the place and what can I really change. Mm-hmm. So I basically spend my time, because you could spend your time forever on this, on two areas. One, education. So, for example, the Pathfinders for after school education. I spend time on that. I spend time on the Irish Arts Center, and I give money to things. But for me, my time is more valuable, mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about what else I'm going to add to that, and probably something to do with education or children. Mm-hmm. And so I have to figure that out. What I'm also trying to do is spend more time with my family. I have 33 nieces and nephews, and I can't spend time with all of them. I don't even know if I'd like to, but a bunch of them I do. And you only get an opportunity for kids to be a certain age once.
Right.
And how many times do we go to work, or how many times do we do this next thing versus stopping and spending mm-hmm. time with children and really helping them through the experiences you may have had? And I know it probably sounds like motherhood and apple pie, but I watch so many times people not spend time with their parents, not spend times with their kids, and yet they're very, very successful. And I say to myself, is that really successful? I'm not so sure.
Right. No, I think, Eileen, I couldn't agree more with you. And in general, this has been fantastic. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry I wasn't more structured. I know I didn't prepare for this, and I didn't, because I just have to say I felt so comfortable with you that I was like, we're just going to have a great conversation, and I'm not going to go away and prepare for it, because in some ways I've been preparing all my life, and you've been incredibly fair and gracious, and the reason for which you're doing this, I think, is just terrific.
And we really appreciate that. So thank you again for joining us, for sharing your incredible insights with us. And, we know how valuable your time and your wisdom is, and we really hope we can do this again soon.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I don't know. I don't buy that it was all that insightful or wisdom, but you know what? I'd leave you with this last thought. There's so many things that are simple sayings that really, if we incorporated them into our lives, everything else works a lot better. Work, family, everything. But anyways,
you're 100%
I digress.
No, that is the essence. That is the essence of it all.
And we all forget that, right? We put the urgent before the important.
Absolutely. The fact that so many of us come back, you mentioned your mother, was kind of the primary role model and inspiration for you. And how many of us actually come back to that way later in life, after all the allure of people that we worshiped and admired sort of has worn off. We always come back to our source. And
my father was a decorated war hero, which I didn't know till he passed away. He passed away when I was quite young. He had silver stars and bronze stars and purple hearts, and he never talked to us about war. And he went into the war quite early because he was like 17, and he was very upset with what was going on in Europe, in Germany in particular. And he said two things. He said, when people die, and I hope you're never around a lot of people that die, but they ask for two things: God and their mother. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's true, but that's what his wisdom was.
Yeah.
So spend enough time on both.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you again, Eileen, and thank you for all our participants. Really appreciate you joining us. And if you haven't yet donated, please do so by going to the donate page at the top right of the site, so we could continue strengthening pediatric mental health in our communities. Eileen, thank you again for your support of Lunches with Legends. We are really grateful for your participation and wishing you and everyone on this call a most wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Take care, Mo. Thank you.
Bye-bye.